So good morning, everyone. Good morning and welcome to day 2 of the Government Open Source Conference here in Portland, Oregon. Thank you for those that have attending in person and for those of us that are joining through live streaming on the internet. We have a great panel this morning, and I'm going to let each of them introduce themselves, but we're going to be talking about a new initiative called Civic Commons. This follows a lot of conversations yesterday about open data, code sharing, and collaboration amongst governments. There have been a number of efforts over the years to do similar things, but this is a refreshed conversation with some great ideas. And the folks that are here to talk about Civic Commons today are most interested in interaction with the audience so we can discuss the ideas, question the ideas, and contribute as it's an emerging concept. So I'm going to turn over the floor to our panelists. And Nick-Grossman, I think, are you going to be helping do the moderation and introduce the panel?
I can do that if you like, and Bryan's going to lead off our, run through our deck.
Great.
So.
Okay, Bryan Sivak, CTO DC, please start. Thank you.
All right.
All right, good morning, everybody. I assume GOSCON is not necessarily an early morning crowd, but thank you guys very much for indulging and showing up. I am going to keep this pretty short. I just want to set a baseline for what it is that we're trying to do here. And I'm guessing that many of you have probably heard of this effort a little bit recently, so I'm going to keep it short because what I really want to do is get into a more interactive kind of question and answer piece. That's much more interesting for me rather than just standing up and talking at you, and I suspect it'll be a lot more interesting for you as well. So briefly, I started at the CTO's office in the District of Columbia as the Chief Technology Officer about a year ago, a little more than a year ago. And DC is a fascinating place because we are the only spot in the country that is a city, a county, and a state all at the same time. What that does is actually gives me a very unique perspective among my peers at the local, county, state, and federal level, just to kind of see sort of what the issues are and what people are working on all across different levels of government across the country. Now, as expected, there's a lot of investment going on right now in technology at every level of government. At the hyper-local level, the small cities, the towns and the villages, there is effort. There is money being spent, which just grows and grows and grows as you go between the bigger cities and the counties and the states, and then obviously the federal side. And so these projects are happening everywhere. One of the things I noticed is that we're all working on the same stuff. And that actually shouldn't come as a huge surprise. Every state has to deliver a Medicaid management information system. Every city has to have some kind of geocoder to identify points on Earth. These things are common across every city and state and jurisdiction. And it turns out that we're reinventing the wheel over and over and over again. We're spending the same money to develop the same stuff, doing it in slightly different ways, in very closed processes, and there's very little communication or collaboration happening between these entities. So what Civic Commons really is designed to do is to really build these connections among the different governments, really make this communication and this collaboration possible, but in a very focused way. We want to really increase and make the most of all of the opportunities out there for sharing and for collaboration. Now, this is nothing new. Okay, this is actually happening to a certain extent in some places. Couple of quick examples. Minnesota, the state of Minnesota recently, a couple of years ago, launched a brand new unemployment insurance system. And this stuff ranges from the big to the small. This is on the big side. They spent over $50 million to build this system. It's the same system in a sense that every single state, actually 56 jurisdictions in the country, need to implement. There are obviously lots of different laws and policies and procedures and differences between each one of those, but it turns out that there's a core of technology and core set of business processes that actually can be ported. So once Minnesota launched this, they actually took this system and actually gave it to Iowa, and Iowa implemented it for just a few million because all they had to do was customize it to their policies and procedures. That's a big deal. The Western states, some Western states right now, are actually collaborating on an infrastructure play. They're actually looking to create a cloud-based storage system for GIS data, for geographical information system data, that they can then share with everyone. and then share the resources that are required to actually build something like this and support it. One of my favorite stories is Pueblo County, Colorado. These guys created a property management assessment system. And it was quickly realized by the surrounding counties and cities that this system actually could be used on their stuff as well. And so Pueblo County said, all right, tell you what, we're going to take this system, we're going to stand it up as a service, and you guys can actually fund us to develop this and to provide that service to you. And that's exactly what they did. The last data I have is that 13 counties and 7 cities are actually using the system that Pueblo County developed. So, I think these are really great examples of some of the stuff that's already going on. So what is Civic Commons going to do? Well, we want to build this platform to really support sharing and collaboration across every jurisdiction, maybe not even just within the United States, but really worldwide. Everybody has to have a lot of these different components. They're going to be basically opportunities for collaboration. So this is kind of the I want, I have, or I need, I have side of the equation. And we want to build a platform that allows people to actually, match their needs with the actual haves that exist out there. The research and communication of best practices, and actually more importantly than best practices, lessons learned in any implementation is a critical component. There's one listserv that I'm a member of that's basically the CIOs from sort of mid-sized cities across the country. And it's fascinating because literally every day there are at least 4 or 5 messages that people post about, hey, I'm looking at moving to a hosted email environment. Who else out there has done that? Does anybody have any lessons learned? Does anybody have an RFP they can share? This stuff is critically important. And if we can reduce the amount of effort going into both the pre-solicitation, then the solicitation, and the actual acquisition of software and technology, whether that's open source or commercial, we're going to save a ton of money across the country. Legal and policy side is, I think, another critical component. Right now in government, it's very, very hard to take something that we've developed and actually open source it. The laws don't really fit very well in many jurisdictions with doing that kind of thing. It's also really hard to, and I'll use the word in quotes, buy open source software. I should say procure open source software, because the legal frameworks that exist right now have absolutely no way of supporting some of these things. For example, we require in DC that anything that the venue and jurisdiction of a contract is based on the laws of the District of Columbia. We like to have somebody to actually sue if something goes wrong. But with open source software, there's actually nobody to sue. And so how do you work that out, right? How do you figure that stuff out? So being able to define this legal and policy framework that makes it easy for cities to adopt these concepts is a critical component of this as well. And then the last part is really, once we've built this, how do we sustain it? The history of I would say the last probably 5 or 10 years is sort of littered with attempts at doing something like this, which are all started with good intentions, get some momentum potentially behind it, but then sort of fizzle away, either due to changes in administrations or changes in political winds or changes in the technology or the ideas that are out there. So another key component here is developing something that's sustainable, something that we can continue to develop, build the community, keep that community together. And I think there's a lot we can learn from, for example, social networking sites. I mean, how does Facebook, for example, manage to keep and maintain this level of communication? These are things that we have to look at and have to figure out. So what are we doing? Well, first, we are building essentially a catalog that lists the applications and tools that have a potential for sharing. Right now it's just a wiki, obviously something very simple to create, but we're working on making this more robust. The plan is really to make this what we're calling a dynamic marketplace, which is going to live on top of external resources. We're not going to redevelop GitHub or SourceForge. Those technologies and communities already exist, and we want to make sure we leverage those things that are already out there. But we want to create this with a really a view towards making this very government-oriented, something that somebody working in a big bureaucracy can actually understand and leverage within the context of what it is that they're actually doing. we want to make sure that we say, what's available and how do we connect the people that have things with the people that want things, and how do we make those connections last. We're looking for projects to put into this that have big potential, and I think the Federal IT Dashboard is a great example of this. We're actually working right now with the developers of this platform to make this an open source piece of code that will then obviously put into the commons. Now, the cool thing about this is that there are already a number of cities who have expressed interest in using this once the code is open sourced and available. And I think this is particularly cool because if the data model can be shared between the federal government, state governments, and local governments, all of a sudden we have some really interesting possibilities for how we look at that information, how we make connections between projects from a programmatic perspective. So there's a lot of potential, I think, in this particular effort. Same thing goes for the enterprise addressing system that San Francisco is currently developing. And actually, they're working with us right now to kind of figure out how they release this as an open source package, how they actually define legislation within the city government itself to make all developments open sourced in the future. So this has a lot of, I think, really interesting potential. And I'll just tell one quick anecdote about this. Literally yesterday, we got an email from someone at the Sacramento Area Council of Governments who said that the city of Sacramento, Sacramento County is finishing a needs assessment right now for exactly this type of software. And they're doing it for 1 county and 6 cities. And this guy who works at the Council of Governments in the Sacramento area saw a screencast of this system that we had put up on the Civic Commons website and said, wait, that's exactly what we're looking for. So now they're taking a look at this to see if it actually fits their needs. And to me, that's a really cool story because all we did was put a 4-minute screencast up about what this technology does, and all of a sudden, a simple demo like that is actually propagating itself to people that have come across it. And that's with no marketing, no push, no conversation. So I think the potential is very highly demonstrated by this one example. The Federal Register is another great example. So if those of you who don't know, the Federal Register is basically sort of the de facto source for all documentation relating to the federal government. Nothing really becomes a true law until it's published in the Federal Register. Beth Novak at the White House is very, very interested in seeing this piece of technology actually translated to the state and local level. She wants to create the neighborhood register and have it all kind of interoperate and talk to each other. Now this, it turns out when you look at the code, is actually easier said than done for a number of different reasons, which I'm sure many of you guys understand, but I look at that as kind of one of the missions of Civic Commons. How do we take something which might be rigid and complex and highly structured and maybe craft it in such a way that we can allow it to be easily implemented on a number of different levels. And then finally, just one more example is Open 311. I'm sure probably most of you have heard of this. If not, it's basically an open API for 311 service requests. This, to me, is a perfect example of something that Civic Commons can do. San Francisco and DC co-developed this and published this API as a standard, and we call it a standard, we use that loosely, for 311 service requests to be entered into systems of record and for communications to happen between third-party applications. The interesting thing to me is how this is developed very, very quickly. So San Francisco uses a system by a company called Lagan to do their 311 backend. We use a system by Motorola. Both vendors have, in the last few months, implemented this API into their systems, and it's now up and running in both San Francisco and DC. Additionally, other private sector organizations have sprung up, such as SeeClickFixed, CitySourced, TweetMy311, and those guys have built the API support in as well. What that means is that now anybody who downloads a SeeClickFixed or CitySource application, for example, onto their iPhone, can utilize it both in San Francisco and in DC automatically. They don't have to do anything else. And that service request goes straight into the database. They get an SR number back. It's followed up on and tracked. It's really pretty cool. And so to me, this is a sort of perfect combination of government, private sector coming together to actually build something that adds value across the spectrum. Civic Commons in general was started by the 4 organizations you see here. OCTO is the Office of the Chief Technology Officer in DC. Code for America is providing a set of fellows to help implement this as a sort of going concern. OpenPlans, where Nick is a part of, is involved, as well as Tim O'Reilly and the whole O'Reilly family. But, you know, there's lots and lots of other people that are involved as well. Obviously, the White House, all of the cities and states you see the logos of, or the cities that you see the logos of here. We're talking to various states. I can't tell you how many emails I get where people kind of stumble across this and say, hey, that's an amazing idea. How can we be involved? So this is growing rapidly, and I think it's, you know, especially once we get some projects into the Commons, this is going to be something that takes off pretty quickly. High-level roadmap. In October, so this month, we're actually, as I mentioned, starting to seed the Commons with various projects. The Code for America Fellows are going to arrive in DC on February 1st and really start building this organization out. And it's not just technology. These are people that are working on marketing and outreach and legal frameworks and things like that. And then I would say mid to late 2011, the idea is that this organization becomes an independent grouping, an independent organization, and is able to sustain itself and kind of carry the ball forward. So how do you get involved? Pretty simply, join the discussion. You see the details right there. If you go to the website, civiccommons.com, you can register to get involved, and we'll hit you up when we need help and we need to reach out to people. But please, you know, get involved with this and look at ways that we can all get together and try to help move this ball forward. I think there's enough sort of potential behind it right now, especially with the projects that are going into it, that we can actually drive this forward pretty quickly. Just a quick thank yous. A lot of people have been involved with this since the beginning and sort of fleshing out the idea and helping to develop this. And that's it. I promised I would keep it short. I'm looking forward to hearing all of the different questions you guys have and engaging in an interesting discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. So just quickly, introductions. I'm Nick Grossman from OpenPlans. We're one of the organizations that's co-founding Civic Commons. And
Dan-melton, CTO for Code for America. We place web geeks in cities.
And I'll just throw a little bit of context behind how we all came together to sort of start working on this. OpenPlans is a nonprofit that works with cities and governments to develop open source tools and also work towards open standards. So we were really involved in helping the Open Through on One API along. And Code for America is working with a number of cities to co-develop open source projects and working with Washington, D.C. on this. And over the past year, we all sort of got to talking about some of the foundation level needs for organizations that are working on collaborative technology projects with government. And we realized that, you know, at OpenPlans, we really wished if there were a place for these kinds of exchanges to happen and for projects to get cataloged and resources to get built up. And Code for America said, wow, we really need the same thing. And we're kind of in the same boat as nonprofits working in this space. And of course, we've been reaching out to lots of other people, including folks from government who bring that important perspective to it. So we really see this as sort of a foundation level piece for sort of technology collaboration in the government space. And we're really actively looking to broaden the community of people that are part of this. And Brian showed a list of collaborators. We've got a great board of advisors and other organizations that are also working on common issues, and a lot of them are in this room today, from Open Source for America to Open Gov Source and others. And so we're really just very excited to see this sort of gaining a lot of traction. So
yeah, I think now, you know, I personally would love to, you know, start a more interactive discussion. I would be surprised if there were no questions out there or nobody who wants to actually make a comment. So Deb's got a microphone. She's wandering around. Excellent.
So my question is, how do you stay focused on the business? You know, one of the, you know, as I've kind of followed some of this, one of the things it looks like is there can be some great tools, but then how do you stay, you know, dialed in so it doesn't become just a technological tool set, but rather, you know, you have, in cases of governments, water, delivery of water, law enforcement, et cetera, so they're not saying, well, you're just generating a lot of tools, but you're not listening to what my business need is. What recommendations do you have for governments to do that, or for CTOs, technology service organizations?
Sure, that's a great question, and actually the sort of, I think it was the third point I made around the policy framework, that's really where that stuff sort of fits in. One of the problems that I've seen is that when you look particularly at an open source solution, very infrequently is there a business case associated with that implementation, a robust one that's been developed in the past and has real case studies and examples behind it that we can point to say, hey, this worked here and it's going to save you money because X, Y, and Z. So one of the ideas within this whole concept, again, it's not just about technology, it's about all of the ancillary sort of supporting materials that are required to have a successful sale, I'll use that in quotes again, but also implementation of any given technology for any purpose. So, for public safety is a great example because those guys are, notorious for being hesitant to try anything new for various reasons. And the argument is, you're going to kill people, people are going to die. That's a hard thing to argue with. So if we have case studies, if we have ROI arguments, if we have, these detailed, glossy brochures, if you will, that actually will help us achieve a lot of these goals, and that's a big part of this as well.
Could we say names and who
yeah.
with? That'd be awesome.
Excellent.
Sure. So I work for the City of Portland as the Information Security Manager.
Hi, my name is Bob. How do you envision CIOs making use of this? What would be the process they would go through to make use of the codes and projects?
It's a little hard to hear you.
I'm sorry. How do you envision CIOs making use of this? What would be the process they would go through?
I think that sort of delves into the I need/I want side of things. So, any jurisdiction has at least a one-year roadmap. And I say at least because usually it's based on a fiscal year budget for the types of technology implementations that they want to put in place and business problems that they want to solve. And so part of the platform is really going to be designed to make it easy to say, hey, I'm trying to do this. What is there out there that exists that I can leverage to help me do this, whatever this is? I see it not being just a tool for CIOs. I see it being a tool for, literally the people on the ground that are actually, doing the heavy lifting and putting these things in place. If there's a sort of one-stop shop, if you will, a catalog of all of the different things out there that they can take advantage of, this is going to become a fantastic resource to look at and figure out and acquire exactly what they need to solve the problem.
And I'll also add that it's also a place for CIOs that are sort of leading on putting code out there to highlight their efforts more broadly. So New York State Senate's a great example where they're already way out front in publishing open code. They're putting all their stuff on GitHub, but still the stuff that they're doing is not necessarily terribly discoverable among other government entities. So we want this to work both ways.
And actually, from sheer curiosity, a quick poll of the room. How many people out here know that the New York State Senate has an open source iPad application for all state legislation publications? a good number, but not everybody, right? And that's,
this is GOSCON.
And this is GOSCON, exactly. I mean, that to me is pretty awesome. And the work that Andrew Hoppin has done up in the New York State Senate is really remarkable work. But we need a much bigger megaphone and a much bigger platform to get the word out there about that. There are any number of local councils, from the city, small city or town level, all the way up to the state level that would actually be able to take advantage of that exact set of code. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting to me.
And I would just add that you have day jobs too, right? I mean, can you spend all day doing your job and then making sure other people can adopt your software? I think we need sort of a bridge to help you sort of package that up and share.
So actually, I'm going to ask a question as a follow-up to this. Is deb-bryant from GOSCON. We have two projects here that are quiet secrets, and let's talk about or address how you might help them. One is in public safety. We have the law enforcement data repository system. It's a web-based information sharing system. It's being used by 3 states, fully open source, and hundreds of agencies. We have another project that runs prisons. In fact, it has a system that runs more prisons than any proprietary vendor. And it's called NCOMS. How can you help these open source projects that exist today be able to be implemented or be used broader to broaden the community for them?
I mean, what you just described is exactly why this exists, right? So public safety, let's start with the records management stuff. You know, that's something that every public safety organization in the country needs. There's no question. If there are, and they're, you know, historically very risk adverse, but if there are really good case studies, people in government who will stand up and say, this is working for us, and here's a very defined implementation plan. Here's where you plug in your specific requirements, and this is kind of how it, you know, comes out in terms of the implementation. Here's the story of what it took for us to adopt this. I mean, all of these pieces of information are necessary to help convince somebody to actually go down that path, especially when they're afraid of trying something new, right? And so we need to build all of those resources. We need to collect them all under one umbrella and make sure that those resources get communicated out to literally everybody out there.
And Deb, you're talking about projects that are already pretty widely adopted and
Yes,
successful.
these are fully mature
Right, so
projects.
that's one case. And then another case is new projects that have potential but aren't widely adopted yet. So in the case of the IT dashboard, it seems clear that there's an interest, but someone needs to put in the extra effort to help get the code generalized and then help find the people who might want to use it and help get them to adopt it. And so that's where we see Civic Commons as sort of a third-party outside organization that has the intent and the resources to help do that, kind of kickstart some of these projects to get them to the point where they can be shared.
Carlos Jensen, Oregon State University. So I think this is a great idea. The real value of this comes from the case studies and the knowledge that you can get about how to adopt these technologies. Who do you envision actually putting those together?
So I mentioned that the fellows that we're bringing in from Code for America are not all technologists, and that's one of the reasons why. We want to start seeding this with people who are able to kind of create this glossy material, if you will, for the various projects that are currently in the Commons, to give good examples and maybe even templates of how this stuff can be created in the future. One of the big problems with any open source project is that it's, you know, usually just a box of code, and there's, you know, often little in the way of documentation, you know, nothing really in the way of support if it's something, especially a new project. And so we need to start creating, I think, tools and templates and examples for things that already exist, so that new projects which come up actually can, you know, literally check those boxes. You know, with this catalog that we're talking about, we're envisioning something that, you know, has placeholders for all of these different items that are required for any project to be successful. So somebody who puts something up there knows, oh yeah, okay, we got to document this thing. Or let's write a white paper, let's create a case study, let's build an ROI spreadsheet calculator that we can put up and let people understand what the value of this project is versus something else.
And I think we see ourselves doing a lot of that extra effort at the beginning, but hopefully over time you see enough examples of how doing that documentation and sort of case study writing can help give a project a little bit more legs, that I would hope that we will build a framework that incentivizes producers and users of certain packages to collaborate on the development of those case studies.
Right, I think you have a strong case for why you want to get the projects themselves to promote themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Right, this is the way to attract more users and more developers, but you're probably going to have to do a fair bit of heavy pushing early on to give a good example of
right.
This is how to do it.
And that's why this is a separate initiative, to help add the extra effort, because everybody's busy, everybody doesn't have time to write case studies and do screencasts and generalize their code. And so we want to sort of be that catalyst to help draw that out in the places that are most promising, and hopefully like kickstart an engine that can give people incentives and a place to do that stuff in an ongoing way.
You know, by the way, at the end of the day, the reason that this needs to be sort of an independent organization supported by some funding model, whether it's foundational funding, whether it's subscription pricing, I don't know. But the idea is that there need to be resources on the staff of this organization that are dedicated to helping jurisdictions with exactly these things. Otherwise, you're never going to get that, I think, critical mass of people who can spend the extra time to do that stuff.
Right.
So just as a funny anecdote, some of the fellows who are coming on board. One is a computer programmer who's also a lawyer. So she knows both sides of sort of the table, and she's worked in and out of government. We have a government barrier breaker is how he applied. He has worked at the federal and the state level in breaking down barriers for code adoption, which I think is really fun. And then we have a guy who spends his evenings and his late hours writing Bibles on code bases. He is a Bible writer. So I'm really excited about the team that's coming on board to help sort of push this. They're going to be able to take code bases and figure out what are the legal implications, how do we package these things up, and then we've got a guy who's going to spend 12 hours every night writing a Bible about it for those who need those very precise documentation procedures.
Hey guys, I'm Gunnar Hellickson from Red Hat and Open Source for America. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the opportunities that individual open source entrepreneurs might have in the context of this, right? Seems like the way you're talking about, especially with the long-term sustainment and the funding model for the organization, I imagine you at the same time want to encourage entrepreneurship in each of the cities, right? I wonder if you could expand on that a little bit.
I'll talk about that for a second. So one of the definite goals of this open marketplace is to bring more transparency to the procurement process. So this might be a sort of a lofty and maybe naive goal, but the idea is that if we can create a place where there's more visibility into the needs and the tools, particularly around open source, that opens up an opportunity for entrepreneurs to say, oh, I see that 5 cities are using this. I'm going to go get smart about that application, and so that I can go provide support. OpenPlans is an organization that does that already around open source projects, and which is part of why we want Civic Commons to exist. So that right now you have to go kind of city by city and do a lot of legwork to understand what the opportunities are, which is a very sort of opaque marketplace that tends to favor larger established firms. So I definitely see Civic Commons as hopefully an engine for opportunity for smaller businesses and entrepreneurs around open source.
And that's part of our goal. One of our goals for our fellows and our fellowship program is that they'll be working in the Commons and then they'll be experts on a number of these apps. And I'm hoping we see some businesses that get started as a result. A lot of our fellows are coming from local cities and they're coming down to the Bay Area. And I'm hoping that as a result of Civic Commons, that when they go back to their cities, they're like, oh, well, I've seen these 7 or other 8 really cool apps that we could sort of implement locally.
Do we have a question from the back of the room?
Hi, a little hot. Ian Schisler with Brain Food and Open Source for America. I'm wondering, with the growth of cloud computing, which is just sort of an overall buzzword for people co-locating their software, do you see these pieces of software being reduced to a sort of software appliance, and that you could have a library of appliances that could be deployed in a standardized cloud environment? Would that be part of the effort?
I don't see why not. Keep in mind that the idea of the organization is not to drive the development of any one type of technology, right? In any direction. It's really to provide a platform for the market as a whole to help decide what becomes part of that civic stack. Given that this thing called the cloud is such a hot topic these days, it would not surprise me to see applications that are designed to be run in an appliance-based fashion, to be something that you connect to the Amazon cloud and just boot up an instance of. Maybe there's even a procurement mechanism built into the whole thing that allows you to sort of set that up on the fly. These are all things that I think are possible, but again, it's something that I think the market really will push the development and adoption of as these things kind of grow and get more established, both on the government side and on the private sector side. I mean, cloud it's an interesting conversation to have, right? And in general, and I don't think any maybe 5 people have the same definition of what that actually means. And especially when you look at the federal side, there is a big mandate for CIOs and technology organizations to adopt this thing called cloud, but they have absolutely no idea what that means in practice. So they're working on defining all of this and trying to figure out, right now exactly how this all works. So it's an interesting conversation to have, and I think maybe one of the ways that Civic Commons can help is to allow the market to define more on, sort of what that means on a day-to-day basis.
Hi, I'm Nate De Niro with Open Affairs Television.
and I've got kind of a two-part question, and it dovetails nicely onto your last answer. So the first part is about open standards, and do you expect that open standards and IP protection around open standards, a la things like the Open Web Foundation, what they're trying to do, will be part of the effort in Civic Commons? And then also, do you see a project's tendency in Civic Commons being a potential endorsement, so that when people go and look at various projects out there, they say, well, I'm only going to stick with something that's in the Civic Commons stack, and maybe the potential for it stifling innovation in other projects popping up or competitive projects and things like that?
I'll take the second question first. And my understanding of where we want to go with the notion of the Civic stack is not that Civic Commons, the organization, will be responsible for endorsing anything, but I hope that we can create a framework where projects can get endorsed by the people who want to endorse them, whether that's users or vendors that support them and so on. So right now we're starting out by picking some projects that sort of have potential, but the longer term vision for this open marketplace is not where the Civic Commons is the gatekeepers for what gets in and what gets out, but that it's a framework for projects building and communicating their own reputation through their constituencies.
And on the first question, I don't think we're really going to be pushing like data definitions, but I think we are talking about a set of principles about open platforms that we want to sort of, I don't know necessarily push, but look at. The project doesn't necessarily need to be open source to be, I think, as part of the Civic stack, but it does need to be open, is data portable. I think, looking at can data move from one system to another without focusing on what that data definition is probably a better way to go, and we'll let the marketplace sort of figure that out.
Here we have a question here.
Hi there, Garrick Bile, founder of Gov Source, which is remarkably similar to Civic Commons, we found out. Our focus is just on health and human services, and as we went through our formation over the last 6 months or so, we really grappled with, do we go broad or do we go specific on a particular vertical? And with government being sort of structurally siloed and having particular areas of interest like Medicaid and those areas requiring a real depth of knowledge, I'm just wondering if you went through the same process of trying to figure out how do we sort of how do we cover everything at any level of depth if we're going broad, federal, local, state, county. I'm wondering how you attract a level of depth of conversation or interaction around any particular program area, and what you think about that, because we really struggled with that in our decision-making processes.
I don't know that, so the general concept for this is a sort of broad platform, right? And as Nick said, it's not meant to be an endorsement. The inclusion in Civic Commons or in the quote Civic stack is not meant to be an endorsement of any one given technology. I think the way that we really look at it is to say, this is a free market type platform, right? The people out there who are using these things will decide kind of what bubbles up to the top. The idea of leveraging resources that exist out there to continue a more in-depth conversation around a focus area. So for example, the stuff in Gov Source in the health and human services area is a perfect link, I think, from this domain to that domain, right? The things that are created out of that side of things at a high level can be imported into this platform to make this sort of a central repository. What do I have versus what do I want? And then if a conversation requires more depth, more information that can be provided in that sort of generic platform, then we point people to those appropriate places. That makes a lot of sense to me. I think that there is a gap in the market right now for both things.
Yeah, and I think that gets back to the idea of being a sort of platform for entrepreneurs of all types. So an organization like Gov Source is another sort of nonprofit entrepreneurial effort to sort of fill a need. And I would hope that Civic Commons can support that in lots of different verticals. So that gets back to kind of our interest at OpenPlans. Our really area of focus is transportation tools, but we see Civic Commons as sort of a baseline foundation for organizations like us and others in every vertical, whether they're vendors or supporters or sort of nonprofit organizations, to kind of plug into that and use that as a foundation.
Another question? So I'll ask you a question from a government point of view. If I'm an IT director and I have to spend the next 6 months of my life figuring out how I'm going to budget something and spend some political coin with a strategy to do something, what am I signing up for? Do you have a crystal ball on how you see a year from now as you form? How will you be funded? And what might a governance structure look like? I know those are big questions, but give me your best first pass at them.
Well, these are ongoing conversations, which have sort of barely started. But I think there are a few things to consider. So first, there are some conversations going on right now with various foundations who have grants that they're willing to give for things of this nature. There's some interest out there to see something like this move forward, and so hopefully we can find some grant funding to bring this along to a certain point as a standalone organization. In terms of a governance structure, we actually Jen at Code for America put out a blog post the other day saying that we're searching for an executive director, which I think is a good first step to defining a governance structure. And one that, I almost would like to leave a little bit flexible until there is somebody in place who wants to take the reins in this thing and drive it forward. I hesitate to put something in place before, there's somebody who can really put their mark on it. In terms of going forward funding, that really is TBD for the most part. We've talked about things like, maybe some kind of value-added service that gets provided for a fee to jurisdictions that want to use this. Maybe there are resources within the organization itself that can be directed towards helping with an implementation or a procurement process or something like that. There are all kinds of different models, I think, that make sense, but we just have to, I think, start by getting the right person in place, getting some funding from foundations to kick it off, getting this thing built with the basic platform, and then move from there. That's my take. These guys might have something to add to that.
Right on.
Thank you. We have a question here in the front.
So Alex Howard, O'Reilly Media. The question, I think, in terms of the business case for cities to use open source, I think you articulated it pretty well at the beginning, is that we're often one of support. You need someone to yell at if something's not working. Mm-hmm. Sometimes people have okay experiences posting in a forum for a given issue, but if it's a problem that's much more critical than that, then you need someone you can rely on. You mentioned just now, actually, the potential for value-added service down the way, right? And there's lots of contractors in DC who provide that, say, for Drupal right now. To what extent do you see their organization evolving to provide expertise in open source for cities? Is that the desired end state or one's end state?
I actually don't necessarily see the organization providing that level of support. What I hope for is for private sector organizations to spring up to help support the things that become sort of popular parts of the stack. So for example, let's say the federal IT dashboard, once it's open sourced, you've got, I don't know, 10 cities around the country who decide, or jurisdictions around the country that decide to implement it. Well, that's a nice little business right there, maybe helping to implement and support that implementation. Maybe there's some change management stuff around it in each jurisdiction. I mean, there are, I think, lots of opportunities for service and support organizations to kind of spring up around this stuff, which, is a great message these days around job creation and all of that kind of stuff. I mean, Red Hat is a great example of an organization that kind of sprang up around a concept like this, and look at where they are right now. So, I think with the appropriate adoption, this has the potential to really spur a new sort of sector of the economy around these things that we all do.
And I'll just add one thing, which is that I do see us adding some of the initial effort to get that to happen. Mm-hmm. So in the case of the IT dashboard, this is a new project. We're putting in our own effort to sort of help it get off the ground, but hopefully that provides enough of a start to help build this ecosystem of support organizations. And other than that, I totally agree with what Bryan just said about this being a framework for entrepreneurs of all kinds that can support projects and be at the other end of the bat phone when things go wrong.
Okay, we have 5 minutes left on our panel. I have a question here in front, maybe time for one more.
Circling back for a moment to the initial question I have, what recommendations do you have for governments to build support structures for any tools that they have? There are lots of examples of whether it be governments, private industry, nonprofits adopting tools, and then the people aren't there to know how they operate, or they're stuck in an old way and then they reject them.
That's a great question. We're in DC. We're running into some of those issues right now. I mean, a really great example is Track DC. We released this thing earlier this year, which is sort of a real-time operational dashboard for individual agency data. And it's a relatively complex code base, and it's one that there's one person who really knows it real well, and if that person leaves, we got a bit of a problem. We recognize that as an issue, and one of the things that we're working on right now is really documenting everything that we need to document in order to make it something that is sustainable and that will exist beyond a transition of personnel and things like that. And I think good old-fashioned documentation is really a good answer to that question. One of the things that I think is beneficial about Civic Commons is that if we take that code, and this is one of the things that we're looking at figuring out how to open source at some point down the road, we take that code and put it in and have a documented framework for implementation, some of the code, all of that kind of stuff. In a way, we've actually increased our potential resources for development and support and further documentation by making it open and putting it out there. So we don't actually have to rely on that one person who's sitting in my office who, if they get hit by a bus, we're screwed. So it's a really important question, and one that I don't know of any jurisdiction off the top of my head that's really dealt with in exactly the right way yet, just because everybody's so busy.
And just to add to that, we've been thinking a lot about at Code for America. Our goal is to develop these open source apps with cities, and then we're hoping to leave them behind and have them still be managed, still have a developer ecosystem around them. And I think we're at the point right now in government where we're putting code up on GitHub, which is great, but we're not really including coders in the development cycle of these applications. So we're seeing this sort of great transparency movement when it comes to our code, but not really sort of a development cycle surrounding the code. And part of it is we're all busy, right? I mean, you're one person or maybe two people, and you're not really, you don't have 15 or 20 people like maybe Drupal does, or Joomla, or Ruby on Rails to manage your open source code base, your bug tracking, your feeds for features, your sprint cycles, et cetera. So I think maybe we need a new model, or we need to be thinking about tools that can help local government officials sort of include developers in that ecosystem to keep those apps going.
Hi, this is Nate De Niro again from Open Affairs TV. I think we can all agree, or we all generally agree, that standards are good and adopting standards have a lot of benefits. But do you see, from a political perspective, some jurisdictional homogeny beginning to form as the project gets traction and people start to adopt the technology? Is that a good thing?
Yes and yes, and I see it at all levels. I was actually just having a conversation with, interestingly speaking of standards, the director of NIST the other day, and he's thinking all about this kind of stuff in many, many different areas. Healthcare and health IT is a big one right now, and one of the questions that's out there, a big debate between the White House and ONC and NIST is, how do you develop standards for health IT in a way that's sort of rapidly iteratable? I'll make up a word there, but we can create these things quickly and change them frequently in order to get something out there that's like a v.01 that can we can quickly build up to a v1 and a v2 and things like that. So everybody's thinking about this at all levels. I think they just need a better communication mechanism to sort of get the word out, get those things posited in the first place. But I think this is where everything's going. I mean, we live in a networked world, right? And the more things can talk to each other, the better.
I think
out of time.
Yeah, I think we're at the end of our time, but I'd like to thank the panelists. I'd like to thank everyone. All the panelists traveled to be here, and in particular, I'd like to thank Bryan, who's literally come in last night on a plane and leaving in a couple of hours, because he's committed to the project, and it was important to have this conversation, and I thank the audience too for their good questions. So I want to give a round of applause to our panel.